Long ago, thick woods covered this whole region. They were mostly broadleaf trees, the kind that lose their leaves in the fall. Birch, elm, and oak were common. Cedar trees grew here, too. The woods stretched north into present-day Canada. They stretched south to the Ohio River Valley and beyond. Algonquin and Iroquois. People first came to this region about 9,000 years ago. They were hunters. They probably spoke early forms of a language called Algonquin. Some of their descendants settled along the Atlantic coast. Others, such as the Ojibwa, ended up near the Great Lakes. About 3,000 years ago, a new culture began here. It was centered near modern-day Hopewell, Ohio. These people were farmers. They probably spoke an Iroquoian language. They built huge mounds as graves for their leaders. Their ways spread far. By 1500, many powerful Iroquois tribes lived along the St. Lawrence River. The Hopewell people made mounds that looked like animals. This snake in Ohio is more than 1,300 feet long. Farming, hunting, and fishing. For the native people of the eastern woodlands, summer and fall were farming seasons. They grew 17 kinds of corn, 60 kinds of beans, and at least 7 types of squash. They also gathered wild rice and other plants for food and medicine. The Ojibwa used sap from maple trees to make candies and drinks. These Iroquois women are grinding corn or dried berries, while a papoose or baby naps. Corn was planted in small hills. Once it sprouted, beans were planted in the same hill. After the harvest, many eastern woodlands villages emptied out. Families were hunting for the winter. They hunted beaver, otter, muskrat, deer, and other animals. Spring brought the fishing season. The northern lakes were often still frozen, but the Indians cut holes in the ice and fished through the holes. Beautiful clothing. Hunters were interested in skins, feathers, and bones as well as meat. The early Indians of this region made their clothes from buckskin and other types of leather. Later, they started using cloth they got from European traders. Women wore long dresses. Men usually wore leggings, kilts, and caps with feathers. Men and women wore jewelry made of bone, hair, copper, colorful stones, feathers, and shells. These flower-like patterns became popular among the Iroquois after they started trading with the Europeans. Clothes were decorated with dyes, beads, quills, and moose hair. Indians made beads from natural items such as shells and teeth, but later they got glass beads from European traders. Their art styles changed at this point. The Iroquois, for example, began using curved lines and flower-like patterns. Longhouse and wigwam. The Iroquois lived in long houses. A longhouse was about 65 feet, 20 meters, long and 18 feet, 6 meters wide. Up to 20 families lived in each log house. Family members were related through their mothers. They belonged to the same clan. Each village had many clans. Each clan had houses in many villages. Women were leaders of the clans. Many clans usually lived in an Iroquois village, each in its own longhouse. Most Algonquin tribes built wigwams, which were smaller houses made of poles and bark. Tribes along the sea lived in settled villages. They made sturdy dome-shaped wigwams. Those near the Great Lakes were nomads. They lived in smaller cone-shaped wigwams that could be built quickly or rebuilt using frames from the year before of this wigwam. Wampum and tobacco. Both Iroquois and Algonquin tribes made wampum. This was a beaded belt of colored shells. The pattern of the shells had a meaning. Wampum often tells the story of a great event. Leaders traded wampum to make agreements. Eventually, wampum was traded for goods, much like money. The beads in this belt of wampum are made of small shells with holes drilled in them. Tobacco, too, was used to seal important promises. For example, when two tribes made peace, the leaders smoked a special peace pipe together. Tobacco was used because it was seen as a sacred plant. The Indians believed its smoke connected a person's prayers to the world of spirits. In the eastern woodlands, a messenger would carry a pipe like this to show that he came to talk, not fight. The spirit world. The Native Americans of the eastern woodlands had strong religious beliefs. These ideas are still very important. They teach that everything in nature has a spirit. The three sisters, for example, are the spirits of corn, beans, and squash. All life, including spirits, have been created by one great spirit. To the Native Americans of the eastern woodlands, a plant like this has its own spirit. The Great Spirit in Indian religions is a force that is in everything and that is everywhere. This force weaves the world together. The Iroquois called it Orinda. The Algonquins call it Manitou. When Indians spoke of medicine, they meant a connection to this force. Indian religions of the eastern woodlands say that one great force holds all of nature together. Festivals and ceremonies. Indian life was rich with celebrations. Many religious festivals were about crops. The Iroquois, for example, celebrated the planting and the harvest. When the green corn got ripe, they had a festival. They had another for blueberries, and so on. The Algonquin tribes had similar festivals. This young Chippewa is dancing at a harvest festival in traditional clothing. Not all ceremonies were about having fun, however. One Iroquois group was called the False Face Society. The members wore ugly masks cut from living trees. At certain times in spring and fall, they went from house to house. They did this to scare away ghosts and evil spirits. Masks like this were supposed to scare away evil spirits. Groups of tribes. Tribes often joined together into larger groups called nations of confederacies. 4 powerful tribes around Lake Huron formed the Huron Confederacy. Another Algonquin group was called the Tobacco Nation. 200 villages near Chesapeake Bay belonged to the Powhatan Confederacy. The most powerful confederacy was the Iroquois League, which was started around 1570. Leaders of 5 tribes gathered to work out laws for the new Iroquois League. The Iroquois League included the Mohawk, Seneca, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Oneida tribes. The Tuscarora joined later. 50 sachems or chiefs from these tribes met each year for a great council. High-ranking women of their clans chose them. These sachems made laws, settled arguments, and decided matters of peace and war. Europeans arrive. In the 16th century, Europeans began exploring North America. They brought tools, guns, glassware, beads, and cloth to America. The Indians traded furs to get the European goods. Tribes were soon killing more animals than ever to get trade goods. In some areas, many of the animals with fur were killed. European traders got rich on the furs they bought from the Indians of the eastern woodlands. Many tribes then started fighting to control lands and the waterways that the animals needed to survive. The Indians needed the furs to keep trading with the Europeans. However, the Europeans also brought illness and diseases with them. Some European illnesses were deadly to Indians. These illnesses spread fast and far. Whole villages of Indians died before even meeting Europeans. Europeans made over 500 voyages to the eastern woodlands by 1620, often bringing deadly disease to this land. The wars. In 1649, the Iroquois League, or group, destroyed the Huron Confederacy. They went on to destroy all the Hurons' allies. Survivors of these battles fled in all directions, but wherever they tried to settle, they had to fight the tribes already living there. The whole eastern woodlands became an area of war. War in the eastern woodlands drove many tribes out of the woods and onto the western prairie. The Europeans were at war, too. Beginning in 1689, the French fought the British for control of North America. The Indians took sides in many of these battles. Finally, in 1763, the British defeated the French and drove them almost completely out of North America. Then the British turned on the Indians, including their former allies. The French and Indian War was really a war between the French and the British. The Indians took sides. Losing the land. Pontiac, an Ottawa chieftain, tried to unite the Indians against all whites. In 1763, his forces took over the Ohio Valley, but when summer ended, the Indian warriors went home. It was not the Indian way to make war year-round, so the British took back what they had lost. Pontiac's dream died. Pontiac united 16 major tribes against the British, but he could not hold his warriors together. Most tribes sided with the British in the American Revolution. Afterwards, they faced new hardships, but George Washington gave their lands to his American soldiers. Some Iroquois moved to Canada. Other Indians were forced into small reservations. By 1880, whites had taken over almost all Indian land in the eastern woodlands. Indian tribes of the eastern woodlands were forced or tricked into signing treaties that took away their lands from them. The 20th century. Over half the Native Americans of the eastern woodlands now live in the cities. In fact, they have helped to build those cities. Mohawk construction workers are fearless about working high above ground, so they have done much of the work on the tall buildings of East Coast cities such as New York. Mohawk construction workers have helped build many bridges and buildings in the East. The Indian past is on display at places like the Oneida National Museum in Green Bay, Wisconsin. But Indian ways are still alive on reservations from Minnesota to Pennsylvania. The Iroquois League still exists. For example, the Great Council still meets once a year to plan a future for today's Iroquois. At this Grand Council of the American Indian, leaders from several tribes plan a course for Native Americans in the modern world. Famous Eastern Woodlands Indians. Eli Samuel Parker, Seneca, 1828 to 1895, became a sachem of his tribe at 23. But he also studied law and engineering at white schools. During the Civil War, he became General Grant's chief assistant. Later, when Grant became U.S. President, Parker was appointed Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Tecumseh was a war chief of the Shawnee Nation. He dreamed of uniting all Indian tribes and building one great Indian nation. In 1812, his powerful army captured Detroit, but William Harrison defeated and killed Tecumseh in 1813 at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Bill Miller, Mohican, 1955, is a musician. His band has played with Pearl Jam and toured with Tori Amos. He writes poetry, sings, and plays the flute. His albums include Raven in the Snow and The Red Road. He is an artist too. His paintings appear on many CD covers.